We're trying to record the sound of the bison across the road. You can hear them snuffling around in the snow, I think chewing noises. And also trying to keep this mic from dying because it's really cold.
I mean, what's really interesting is that this is a great example of the snow illuminating the behavior. It's like shadows of their movement mapped into the noise of the snow. Sound itself is about the interaction between things. There is some energy that comes into the world, but it only becomes sound when it generates a waveform across some medium. So the bison move the snow makes the sound, it comes into contact with the air molecules, the longitudinal waves propagate through the air, and by contrast, with smell, with touch, with taste, we come into contact with the thing.
When we began collaborating, it was a way for the arts to help sciences and humanities reflect on the temporalities involved in climate change broadly, which is one of the hardest things to think well about. And of course, it's a place that has compelled attention in the first place because of these volcanic histories, these geologic histories.
I mean, we can hear that. The sound that we perceive is on the one hand simply a vibration carried across air molecules and interacting with our physiology. Listening and hearing is about interconnectedness by definition, really, because sound requires an impulse in an elastic medium. Sound is propagated, unlike other energy that we sense, it's propagated through the connection between things. You don't touch the object itself, but rather the energy from the impulse propagates through a medium, through a series of actions that your body transfers hearing into listening.
There's a way of being in the world that I forgot about, that the listening exercise really gives me. And it's like this feeling of overcoming myself, like all of this like self-centered chatter that's in my head. I get a little bit of distance from that, and it's like really amazing. Like I think it feels really good to like turn down the volume on my selfishness. Feels really great, actually. The landscape and my ability to pay attention to it exists on a continuum, and so it's hard to say like where my aesthetic experience of the world ends and where the actual world begins.
It's the same thing when you look through binoculars. It's like, yes, you get to zoom in, but at the same time you lose all your peripheral vision and you're just in an altered state of reality where you are replacing your ears with the microphone. And it allows you then to think in a different way, and maybe that thinking in a different way is just less comfortable, and so you kind of close down some of the internal dialogues so that you can attend to it. Sound is this thing that can cross the boundaries without violating private property laws, and it makes me look for other ways that sanctuary could kind of rise up and escape from the boundaries that we define the sanctuary.
The boundary is so artificial. It's not a smart boundary, and there's an ideal of what it should be, but then it doesn't match the ecological systems. Nature doesn't work that way, right? It doesn't respect our lines drawn in the sand, right? Nature doesn't work that way. And the consequences for those other species are, really serious.
In the beginning, we buffered Yellowstone Park, and it's all still there with national forest and public lands that were earmarked originally for wildlife buffer zones, for migration corridors, to let a breathing valve happen in this space. But Yellowstone is a high elevation plateau. It's not ideal year-round habitat, and these animals have to be able to migrate. You can't make arbitrary lines and expect wildlife to follow your lead. No matter what your management plan does, you're never going to stop these buffalo from being buffalo.
The buffalo, that they have to be hazed back into the park, like they're being driven out of the world, actually.
Yellowstone is an interesting sanctuary because it's managed to be a place where people don't live generally, except for a few managers. The bison, when they're driven back in, they're driven out of the socialized human world. And maybe also for modern peoples who who come to think of nature as having to live in the no place.
The integrity of the boundaries of the park don't stand up to climate change.
The way that these places that have been set aside without any relation to planetary changes or global forces are now caught up in those global forces in ways that complicate their boundaries. The very attempt to set aside something is undermined. Then what goes on, right? Like, what role do they play, both culturally and ecologically, in responding to these global stresses? How do they keep producing specialness in a way when the specialness is under threat? And wow, did we hear that? The whole experience of this place is now shadowed by anxiety and fear of loss, which is a profoundly transvaluing of the experience of this place.
The biggest uncertainty in the future is it's about what we'll do politically, whether we choose to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions or not. I'm not a church-going person, I've never been religious, but I think it's probably one of the same sorts of things that people get out of a religious experience. As someone who feels pretty attached to Yellowstone, they say that we need to keep warming to less than 1.5 degrees. Well, all of the scenarios that make that possible, to keep warming to some kind of viable level, all of those plans assume that we will develop industrial scale technology to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, and that hasn't been invented yet. If that does happen, then whatever we save in Yellowstone now will become newly viable in the future. So if we save some of the forest, some of the old growth, and then we, quote, fix the climate, more or less, then those forests will be able to persist. If we just give up and let it go now, then it's gone. If we fix the problem later, there's no chance of getting it back.
Sanctuaries are set aside to not be what white civilization is doing to this landscape. We can work as hard as we possibly can to maintain this ecosystem and to lessen the footprint of, human beings in this space, and yet our footprint is so big that this space is being imperiled by things that are happening.
Right, and there is no boundary.
Half a globe away, there is no boundary.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We've heard from so many people that love this park that we can not look to the future with the surety of optimism.
We're going to look for a Native American site. It's been described as fasting bed. It's literally where tribe members would go in solitude and fast for a period of 4 days at a time up here. This is a great kind of space to ask what we mean by the word spirituality and what we mean by religion. So that's why I brought my friends up here to see if they had any good ideas.
Just think about the idea that narrative implies change over time, and that people are overlaying their own narratives onto this place, and that you are overlaying your own narrative with a different place. I don't think that means we're not taking Yellowstone itself seriously. I think we're doing something natural that enables us to relate to and care to this place in a way that hits home.
When we think about the humanities lab, this idea of a humanities lab, I kind of thought that we could actually create conditions where we could observe the world without there being this kind of observation bias. But inevitably what we found with the people that we've talked to is that the nature of our project affects them. And so they're sort of changing the way that they're talking or thinking about what they're saying potentially. So we're bringing something into it also, just by having a framework for thinking.
Yeah. Not announcing is its own metaphysic. It's like you thought you could not announce or not or be invisible or whatever, right?
Yeah.
We're just like perception machines, not relation machines.
Yeah, I thought that to be ethical in this context was to be just an observer without any attached context, but actually it's more ethical to announce yourself and to be forthright with what you are, to disclose what you are.
What does this geography compel us to believe? What does this geography allow us to believe? What obligations, if any, follow from our beliefs?